Rachel Morrison had learned long ago that the smallest gestures often carried the heaviest weight. The way she twisted the steel ring on her pinky finger while sitting alone in Lincoln High's cafeteria wasn't nervous fidgeting, it was a reminder. Control is power, the engraving read, words her sparring partner had carved before Rachel left her old life behind. What those watching her eat lunch in silence didn't understand was that real power wasn't about hurting people. It was about knowing when not to. The Tuesday lunch crowd at Lincoln High moved with the predictable rhythm of suburban hierarchy. Football players claimed the center tables like kings holding court, their voices carrying across the cavernous space with the confidence of the untouchable. Cheerleaders orbited nearby, and the rest of the student body arranged themselves in careful concentric circles of decreasing social value. Rachel had found her place in the furthest corner, back to the wall, where she could see everything and be seen by no one who mattered. She'd been at Lincoln exactly 2 months, 3 days, and 17 hours. Not that anyone was counting, least of all Rachel herself, who had become expert at blending into backgrounds since her father's career as a forensic accountant had imploded spectacularly. When you expose a multi-million-dollar fraud at one of Denver's most connected construction firms, you don't just change jobs, you change zip codes, school districts, and hope that reinvention might actually stick this time. The cafeteria at Lincoln felt more like a stadium than a dining hall. Trophy cases lined the walls, their glass surfaces reflecting the afternoon light, streaming through windows that looked out onto the pristine football field where dreams were made and futures decided every Friday night. Even the lunch tables seemed arranged to showcase the elevated platform where the varsity football team held court, their Letterman jackets draped over chairs like royal robes. Rachel had noticed Brad Thompson on her first day. It would have been impossible not to. 6 feet 2 inches of sculpted muscle moving through hallways with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no, never been denied, never learned that the world might not revolve around his wants and needs. His jersey number 17 hung retired in the trophy case despite him being only a junior, an honor typically reserved for graduated legends. The placard beneath it read, "Most rushing yards in school history. Future state champion." Even the building itself seemed to bend around Brad Thompson's gravitational pull. What Rachel hadn't expected was for Brad to notice her back. It started small, the way these things always do. A smile across the hallway that lingered just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Comments about her mysterious new girl energy that he'd deliver just loudly enough for his friends to laugh along. Questions about why she didn't come to parties, didn't cheer at games, didn't seem interested in having fun like everyone else. The first direct approach came during her 3rd week, right after PE class, when most students had scattered to their next periods. Rachel was walking toward the locker rooms when Brad fell into step beside her, his presence commanding the hallway like a force of nature. "You know, most girls at this school would kill for 5 minutes of my attention," he said, not bothering with preliminaries. His voice carried that particular brand of arrogance that came from 17 years of being told you were special. "But you act like I'm invisible." Rachel kept walking, her pace steady and unhurried. "Maybe that's because you are." The silence that followed was deafening. In the distance, she could hear the squeak of sneakers on gym floors, the slam of locker doors, the ordinary sounds of a school day continuing around them. But in their small bubble of space, everything had stopped. Brad's hand caught her elbow, not roughly, but with enough pressure to make his point. Nobody says no to Brad Thompson. When Rachel turned to face him, Something in her expression made him take a half-step back. Her gray eyes held the kind of stillness that came before storms, and for just a moment, the confident smile faltered on his lips. "I just did," she said simply, and walked away. That was when the pranks started. Her locker combination mysteriously changed overnight, forcing her to cut the lock and replace it with her own. The tires on her Honda Civic deflated in the parking lot, not slashed. Nothing criminal, just the kind of mischief that school administrators would dismiss as teenage hijinks. Dead roses appeared in her backpack with little notes attached, "R.I.P. to your social life. Maybe try being friendlier. Last chance before you disappear completely." Rachel documented everything: photos, times, witnesses when she could find them. She brought the evidence to the guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, a well-meaning woman in her 50s who wore cardigans and kept inspirational quotes taped to her desk. "Rachel, honey, I understand you're having trouble adjusting," Mrs. Patterson said, barely glancing at the photos spread across her desk. "Moving to a new school is always difficult, but Brad Thompson is one of our finest students. Maybe you misunderstood his intentions. There's nothing to misunderstand about someone deflating my tires. Do you have proof? It was Brad specifically. The parking lot doesn't have cameras. His friends posted videos on social media of them laughing about deflated egos matching deflated tires." Mrs. Patterson shuffled the papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make problems disappear. "Boys will be boys. Rachel, maybe try being a little more approachable. You might find you have more friends than you think." The conversation with Coach Thompson went even worse. Rachel had requested a meeting after finding her gym locker superglued shut for the third time. She sat across from Brad's father in his office, surrounded by decades of trophies and framed photographs of championship teams. Coach Thompson looked like an older, broader version of his son, with the same confident smile and the same assumption that the world should arrange itself around his convenience. "Look, sweetheart," he said, leaning back in his chair with the casual authority of someone who had never been challenged. "I know Brad can be enthusiastic, but he's a good kid with a bright future. Full ride to State University, probably going pro after that. You wouldn't want to do anything that might jeopardize that, would you? I want him to leave me alone. And I want my son to be happy. Maybe there's a middle ground here. A little flexibility on your part, a little distance on his. What do you say?" The smile he gave her was the same one she'd seen Brad use in the hallways. The expression of someone who had never learned the difference between being charming and being entitled. "I'll make sure he keeps his distance," Rachel said, standing to leave. "That's my girl. I knew you'd see reason." But Brad Thompson had never learned the meaning of distance, and his father had never taught him the value of the word no. The harassment escalated with the precision of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Her car was blocked in the parking lot every morning by accidentally parked trucks. Her usual lunch table was mysteriously reserved for team meetings. Whenever she tried to sit down, teachers began calling on her less frequently, and when they did, it was with the tired expression of people who had been given very specific instructions about keeping certain students happy. Rachel adapted the way she always had by becoming smaller, quieter, more invisible. She ate lunch in her car when the weather was nice, in empty classrooms when it wasn't. She arrived early and left late to avoid the crowd dynamics that made her such an easy target. She kept her head down and counted the days until graduation like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. But adaptation had its limits. The soup incident happened on a Friday in November, just before the biggest game of the season. The cafeteria was especially crowded, electric with the kind of pre-game energy that made teenage boys feel invincible and teenage girls forget their own names in the presence of Letterman jackets. Rachel had claimed her usual corner table, working through calculus problems while eating a turkey sandwich she'd brought from home. She should have seen it coming. The way conversations quieted as Brad and his crew approached. The way phones came out, held low but ready. The way the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something that had been planned, rehearsed, and executed with the brutal efficiency of a military operation. "Well, well," Brad said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent space. "Look what we have here. The Ice Queen, sitting all alone. Again." Tyler Jenkins flanked his left side, 300 pounds of offensive line muscle with the kind of cruel smile that came from never having to face consequences. Marcus Rivera held the right, his wrestler's build coiled with the promise of violence. Jake Morrison, no relation, despite the name, brought up the rear. Baseball pitcher's precision in every movement. Rachel felt the familiar weight of the steel ring on her finger. Control is power. She twisted it once, a motion so small it was barely visible, and continued working on her calculus problems. "You know what I think," Brad continued, moving closer. The script was clearly rehearsed, each word calculated for maximum humiliation. "I think our new friend here needs to learn about school spirit, about being part of the team." "Yeah," Tyler added, his voice a rumbling bass note. "She's been real unfriendly since she got here." "Antisocial," Marcus agreed. "Stuck up," Jake concluded. Rachel looked up from her homework for the first time. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. 200 students holding their collective breath for what would come next. Even the lunch staff had stopped serving, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded either triumph or disaster. "Maybe," Brad said, his smile widening as he gestured to Tyler, who was holding a steaming bowl of tomato soup. "Maybe our Ice Queen just needs warming up." Time moved differently in moments like these. Rachel would later remember the way the light caught the surface of the soup as Tyler lifted it high above her head. The way her gray hoodie, the one her uncle had given her, the one that still smelled faintly of the gym where he'd taught her to fight, absorbed the liquid like a sponge, absorbing blood. The way the burning sensation spread across her shoulders and down her back. Not quite hot enough to cause real damage, but hot enough to hurt, to humiliate, to mark her as prey in front of everyone who mattered. She would remember the laughter that erupted around her, sharp and cruel, and filled with the kind of mob mentality that turned ordinary teenagers into something resembling predators. She would remember Brad's voice rising above it all. "There we go! Maybe hot soup will melt that Ice Queen attitude." But most of all, she would remember the moment her breathing changed. It started deep in her chest, a rhythm her uncle had taught her during their first sparring session 6 years ago. In through the nose, slow and controlled. Out through the mouth, steady and purposeful. The chaos around her began to fade, replaced by the crystalline clarity that came with absolute focus. Rachel stood slowly, soup dripping from her hoodie onto the cafeteria floor. She shrugged out of the ruined garment with deliberate care, revealing the compact muscle definition that came from years of serious training. Her gray t-shirt clung to her frame, and for the first time since arriving at Lincoln High, every person in that room could see exactly what they were dealing with. "You know what's funny about football players?" she said. her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. She reached for the mop that Tyler had abandoned nearby, testing its weight with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to turn anything into a weapon. "You're trained to run in straight lines." The cafeteria had gone silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. This was the quiet that came before earthquakes, before storms, before everything changed forever. "MMA fighters," Rachel continued, her fingers adjusting their grip on the mop handle. "We think in circles." Brad's confident smile flickered for the first time. "What are you?" He never finished the question. 40 seconds. That's all it took for Rachel Morrison to dismantle the social order of Lincoln High School and announce to everyone watching that their understanding of power had been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The mop handle found the pressure point on Brad's wrist with surgical precision. The kind of accuracy that came from knowing anatomy better than game film. His confident laughter turned into something else entirely as Rachel's movement continued, a fluid demonstration of leverage and physics that left him on his knees before he fully understood what was happening. Tyler charged next rookie mistake. 300 pounds of muscle meant nothing when it was moving in a predictable direction. Rachel redirected his momentum with the casual efficiency of someone changing channels, and Tyler's shoulder separation would require surgery and 8 weeks of physical therapy. Marcus hesitated just long enough to prove he was smarter than his friends, but not quite smart enough to walk away. The hyperextended elbow would heal, eventually, but his wrestling season was over before it began. Jake, demonstrating the wisdom that had made him a decent pitcher and an excellent survivor, backed away with his hands raised. "Your dad taught you plays," Rachel said, standing over the wreckage of Lincoln High's social hierarchy. Her breathing hadn't changed, hadn't accelerated, hadn't betrayed even the slightest strain from what had just occurred. "My uncle taught me anatomy. Guess which is more useful?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Tyler groaning and Brad's sharp intake of breath as he cradled his wrist. Phones were out everywhere now, recording from every angle, uploading to every platform. The story was already being written, rewritten, shared, and shaped by hundreds of digital witnesses who would turn this moment into legend or liability, depending on which version gained traction first. Rachel picked up her backpack, her calculus homework somehow still neat and orderly despite everything that had happened around it. She looked at the crowd of faces staring back at her, some shocked, some terrified, some showing the first glimmers of something that might have been respect. "Next time," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent cafeteria, "ask permission before you touch someone else's property." She walked toward the exit, her steps steady and unhurried, leaving behind the kind of scene that would be talked about for years to come. Behind her, she could hear the beginning of chaos, teachers rushing in, students babbling explanations, administrators trying to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled far beyond their ability to manage. But Rachel Morrison kept walking. Because she had learned something important during her 17 years on Earth, sometimes the only way to stop being a victim was to stop allowing other people to write your story. As she pushed through the cafeteria doors and into the hallway beyond, she twisted the steel ring on her finger one more time. Control is power. It reminded her, and for the first time since arriving at Lincoln High, Rachel Morrison felt like she was finally in control. The question was, what would happen next? Because in a place like Lincoln High, where football was religion and Brad Thompson was the golden boy, what Rachel had just done wasn't just self-defense. It was revolution. And revolutions, Rachel was about to learn, always came with consequences. The suspension came before Rachel even made it to her locker. Principal Martinez intercepted her in the hallway, his face bearing the particular expression of a man who had spent his career navigating between doing what was right and doing what was convenient. "Miss Morrison, I need you to come with me, now." The walk to his office felt like a perp walk. Students parting in the hallways like she was radioactive. Word traveled fast in high schools, but social media traveled faster. By the time they reached the administrative wing, Rachel's phone was buzzing with notifications texts from numbers she didn't recognize, friend requests from strangers, and video after video of herself dismantling Brad Thompson's crew with clinical precision. "Sit," Principal Martinez said, closing his office door with the kind of deliberate care that suggested what happened next would determine the trajectory of several lives. The office smelled like coffee and disappointment, decorated with motivational posters that had lost their meaning through years of administrative compromise. Principal Martinez settled behind his desk, a barrier between himself and the girl who had just shattered his carefully maintained equilibrium. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already made up his mind but was required to go through the motions. "I defended myself. You hospitalized 3 students. I stopped 3 students from continuing to assault me." Rachel's voice remained steady, matter of fact. "There's a difference." Principal Martinez opened a folder that was already surprisingly thick for an incident that had happened less than an hour ago. "Brad Thompson's wrist is fractured. Tyler Jenkins requires surgery for a separated shoulder. Marcus Rivera has ligament damage that could affect his athletic career permanently. And I have second-degree burns on my back from the soup they poured on me. That was an accident." "No, it wasn't." Rachel leaned forward, her gray eyes holding his with unwavering intensity. "And you know it wasn't. Just like you know the tire slashing wasn't random vandalism, and the locker tampering wasn't a prank, and the systematic harassment I documented and reported to your staff wasn't teenage hijinks." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that couldn't be said. Principal Martinez had been at Lincoln High for 15 years. He knew how the ecosystem worked, knew which students were untouchable and why, knew that his job security depended on keeping certain parents happy and certain boosters writing checks. "The videos are already viral," he said finally. "I've got the school board calling. I've got parents demanding answers. And I've got the local news asking for statements. This isn't going away fitfully." "Good. Miss Morrison, you're suspended pending a full investigation, given the severity of the injuries involved. Criminal charges are being considered. I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel." Rachel stood, shouldering her backpack with the same unhurried precision she'd shown in the cafeteria. "I'll be in touch with my lawyer. In the meantime, you might want to review the surveillance footage from the parking lot over the past 2 months. I'm sure it'll be very educational." She was halfway to the door when Principal Martinez spoke again. "Rachel, off the record. Why didn't you just give him what he wanted? It would have been easier for everyone." Rachel turned back, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Because some things aren't for sale, Principal Martinez. You should try remembering that." The suspension gave Rachel something she hadn't expected: time. 3 days of mandatory exile while the administration figured out how to spin the situation in their favor. 3 days while lawyers were consulted and statements were crafted. and damage control strategies were deployed. Rachel spent those 3 days doing what her father had taught her. She investigated. The approach came on her second day home, a knock on the door just after 9 in the morning when her parents were both at work. Rachel opened it to find a thin, nervous-looking boy with thick glasses and a messenger bag bulging with documents. "Kevin Park," he said, extending his hand with the formal precision of someone who took journalism very seriously. "Editor of the Lincoln Herald. I was wondering if we could talk." Rachel had seen Kevin around school, one of those invisible students who existed in the academic spaces that football players avoided. She gestured him inside, noting the way his eyes immediately catalogued her living space with reporter's instincts. "Nice house," he said, settling into the chair she offered. "Your dad's the forensic accountant, right? The one who exposed the Morrison construction fraud." "That's him. Must run in the family. The investigating thing, I mean." Kevin pulled out a digital recorder, old-fashioned and serious. "Mind if I record this?" "Depends what we're talking about." Kevin's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Corruption, mostly. The kind that makes what happened to you look like a sideshow." For the next 2 hours, Kevin Park laid out a story that made Rachel's harassment seem like a minor subplot in a much larger conspiracy. His father, Agent David Park of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, had been building a case against high school sports betting operations across Colorado for the better part of 2 years. The investigation had led them to Lincoln High, specifically to Coach Thompson and what appeared to be a sophisticated gambling and money laundering operation hidden behind the school's successful athletic program. "The numbers don't add up," Kevin explained, spreading financial documents across Rachel's kitchen table. "The Booster Club raises $200,000 a year. But somehow, the football program operates on a budget of $600,000. The Champions Foundation, that's their charity arm, reports donations that don't match bank deposits. And they're buying equipment from companies that don't seem to actually exist." Rachel studied the papers with the eye her father had trained, seeing patterns that most people would miss. Shell companies, classic money laundering setup. Take dirty money, run it through fake businesses, claim it as legitimate donations. Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Kevin pulled out his phone, scrolling to a series of screenshots. "My dad's been monitoring betting patterns on Lincoln High games. Someone with inside information has been placing very large, very accurate bets on everything from point spreads to individual player statistics. Information like whether the starting running back is going to mysteriously fumble in the fourth quarter, or whether the quarterback is going to throw an interception at exactly the right moment to keep the point spread under 14. Kevin's expression was grim. "They're not just gambling, Rachel. They're fixing games, and they're using the players to do it." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Brad's aggressive confidence, his untouchable status, his father's casual threats about protecting his son's future. The whole system was rotten, and Rachel had stumbled into the middle of it by refusing to play along with Brad's expectations. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked. "Two things. First, your suspension gives us a window, while everyone's focused on the cafeteria incident. They're not paying attention to other investigations. Second," Kevin hesitated, then pulled out another document. "My dad thinks they're going to try to eliminate the problem. You." The police report was dated the day after the cafeteria incident. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that Rachel Morrison was involved in an underground fighting ring, that her training suggested professional violence, and that her presence at Lincoln High posed a threat to student safety. "Let me guess," Rachel said. "Anonymous tip, filed by someone with detailed knowledge of your MMA background, your uncle's training methods, and your family's relocation history. Information that should have been confidential. Rachel felt the familiar weight of the steel ring on her finger. Control is power. But sometimes power meant accepting help from unexpected allies. What do you need from me? The plan Kevin outlined was elegant in its simplicity. His father needed evidence of the gambling operation, proof of game fixing, and documentation of the money laundering. Rachel needed to clear her name and expose the system that had made her a target. Together, they could accomplish both. The first break came from an unexpected source. Jessica Martinez had been Brad Thompson's girlfriend for 2 years before she'd had enough of his particular brand of toxic masculinity. She appeared at Rachel's door on Thursday evening, her usually perfect makeup streaked with tears and her left wrist wrapped in an ace bandage. "He's going to kill me for talking to you," she said, settling into the same chair Kevin had occupied 2 days earlier. "But after what happened in the cafeteria, I can't pretend anymore." Jessica's story poured out like water through a broken dam. The gambling operation was bigger than Kevin had suspected, involving not just Lincoln High but a network of schools across the state. Brad wasn't just a participant, he was a recruiter, using his status and his father's connections to identify vulnerable players who could be leveraged into cooperation. "He showed me the books once," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wanted to impress me with how much money they were making, player statistics, injury reports, even test scores that might affect eligibility. They bet on everything." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through screenshots she'd taken during their relationship. Bank deposits, text message conversations, even photos of Brad counting cash in his bedroom. 2 years' worth of evidence, carefully documented by a girl who had suspected she might need it someday. "This one's from last month," she said, showing Rachel a photo of a handwritten ledger. "That's his dad's writing. Look at the amounts." The numbers were staggering. Individual bets in the tens of thousands, payouts that dwarfed most people's annual salaries, and at the bottom of each page, initials that matched Lincoln High's coaching staff, booster club leaders, and even some school board members. "Why didn't you report this before?" Rachel asked. Jessica's laugh was bitter. "To who half the people who should be investigating are getting paid? And Brad made it very clear what would happen if I ever crossed him." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing bruises in various stages of healing. "He called them motivation sessions, said I needed to understand how important it was to stay loyal." Rachel stared at the evidence spread across her kitchen table, understanding finally why her simple refusal to date Brad Thompson had triggered such an extreme response. She hadn't just rejected a teenage boy's advances, she'd threatened a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise by refusing to be controlled. "There's one more thing," Jessica said. "They're planning something for homecoming. Brad's been bragging about a big score, something that's needing to set him up for life, whatever it is. It's happening Friday night." The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unlikely source of all. Tom Bradley had been Lincoln High's head custodian for 23 years, invisible to students and faculty alike, despite his daily presence in every corner of the building. Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and careful observer of human nature. Tom had spent 2 decades watching the Lincoln High ecosystem evolve from innocent school spirit into something far more sinister. He found Rachel on Friday morning. Approaching her as she sat in her car outside the school building, she was no longer allowed to enter. "Heard you've been asking questions," he said, settling into the passenger seat with the easy familiarity of someone who had seen enough of the world to be surprised by very little. Heard you might be interested in answers." Tom Bradley was 71 years old, with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. His service in Vietnam had taught him to recognize corruption in all its forms, and his years at Lincoln High had given him a front-row seat to watch good intentions rot into institutional decay. "Coach Thompson thinks he's clever," Tom said, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket. "Thinks nobody pays attention to the help. But custodians see everything, especially when they've got keys to every door in the building." Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents from Coach Thompson's office safe bank statements, betting records, player contracts that weren't supposed to exist, and a complete accounting of the Champions Foundation's actual operations. The evidence was damning, detailed, and absolutely conclusive. "Took me 6 months to copy all this," Tom said. "Had to wait for the right moments. Make sure the combinations hadn't changed. But Vietnam taught me patience, and 23 years here taught me that sometimes good people have to take risks to stop bad people from winning." Rachel studied the documents, her father's training allowing her to trace the money flow with growing amazement. The operation was even more sophisticated than they'd suspected, involving offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transactions, and a web of shell companies that stretched across multiple states. "Why now?" she asked. "Why help me?" Tom's smile was sad and knowing. "Because I've watched too many good kids get chewed up by this system. And because what you did in that cafeteria reminded me that sometimes one person with courage can change everything." He pointed to one of the bank statements. A deposit dated for the upcoming Monday. "That's their homecoming payout. 7 figures, all dependent on the game going exactly the way they've planned. They're betting everything on tomorrow night. Then we stop them tomorrow night." "Well, Tom's eyebrows rose. "You didn't collect all this evidence just to hand it over and walk away. You're invested in seeing this through." Tom Bradley's laugh was rough but genuine. "Lady, I've been invested for 23 years. About time someone else joined the fight." The homecoming game at Lincoln High was always the social event of the season, but this year felt different. The cafeteria incident had created a buzz that extended far beyond the usual school boundaries, with local news crews and social media influencers descending on the campus like vultures sensing carrion. Rachel watched from her car in the parking lot, officially banned from school grounds but close enough to execute the plan Kevin and his father had developed. Agent Park and his team were positioned throughout the crowd, their surveillance equipment hidden among the genuine fans and curious onlookers. The wire Rachel wore was smaller than she'd expected, barely noticeable beneath her jacket. Her role was simple: get Brad to confess to the gambling operation on record, provide evidence of the threats and coercion, and give the FBI probable cause for the arrests they'd been planning for months. Brad found her exactly where they'd arranged to meet, behind the equipment shed, away from the crowds and cameras. He looked different somehow, his usual confidence replaced by something sharper and more desperate. The injuries from their cafeteria encounter had healed, but the damage to his reputation was still fresh. "You came," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Wasn't sure you would." "You said you had a proposition." "I'm listening." Brad's smile was the same predatory expression she'd seen that first day in the hallway, but now she could see the calculation behind it. "Smart girl, I knew you'd come around eventually." For the next 15 minutes, Brad Thompson laid out his entire operation with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. The game fixing, the money laundering, the network of compromised officials and corrupted players. He bragged about the amounts of money involved, the sophistication of their methods, and his plans for expanding the operation once he got to college. "You could be part of this," he said, stepping closer. "Forget the cafeteria thing. Forget the suspension. You're smart. You're tough. And you don't scare easy. Those are valuable qualities in this business. And if I say no," Brad's expression hardened, "then you'll find out what happens to people who threaten my family's livelihood. You think what happened before was harassment. You have no idea what real pressure looks like." The threats continued for another 10 minutes, each one more explicit than the last. Brad detailed plans for destroying her family's reputation, her father's career, her mother's veterinary practice. He spoke casually about violence, about making problems disappear, about the network of connections that made his family untouchable. Rachel let him talk, her expression neutral, while the wire recorded every word. When he finally ran out of threats and promises, she twisted the steel ring on her finger one last time. "You know what, Brad? I think I'll pass." "Wrong answer," he said, reaching for her arm. That's when the FBI moved in. Agent Park and his team emerged from positions around the equipment shed like ghosts materializing from shadow. Brad Thompson, caught mid-threat with his hand on Rachel's arm and his confession recorded in perfect digital clarity, found himself face down on the ground before he could fully process what was happening. "FBI, nobody move." The arrests that followed were swift and comprehensive. Coach Thompson was pulled from the sidelines during the third quarter, handcuffed in front of the entire homecoming crowd. Boosters, school board members, and 3 additional players were taken into custody as federal agents executed search warrants across the county. By midnight, 47 people had been arrested in connection with the largest high school sports gambling conspiracy in Colorado history. $4.2 million in assets were seized, including Coach Thompson's boat, Brad's college fund, and the Champions Foundation's entire bank account. The local news coverage ran for weeks. ESPN picked up the story. Netflix optioned the rights. But for Rachel Morrison, the most satisfying moment came 3 days later when she received an email from MIT's admissions office. "Dear Miss Morrison," the email began, "your essay on applied physics in conflict resolution, a practical analysis, was among the most compelling applications we've received this year." She'd written about the mop, of course, about leverage and momentum and the precise application of force to achieve maximum effect with minimal effort, about the physics of standing up to bullies and the mathematics of justice. The admissions committee had been impressed enough to offer her a full scholarship. 6 months later, Rachel Morrison stood at the podium in Lincoln High's auditorium, addressing a packed audience of students, parents, and school officials. The Fair Play Initiative she'd founded had grown beyond anyone's expectations, creating anonymous reporting systems for student athletes and establishing oversight programs for high school sports across 3 states. "Change doesn't happen because institutions decide to be better," she told the crowd. "Change happens because individuals decide to stop accepting what they know is wrong." In the audience, she could see Kevin Park taking notes for his final Lincoln Herald article before graduating. Jessica Martinez sat with her parents, her wrist finally healed and her confidence restored. Tom Bradley stood near the back, his purple heart gleaming on his custodian's uniform. And even Agent Park had come to see the conclusion of the case that had defined his career. The steel ring on Rachel's finger caught the auditorium lights as she concluded her speech. "Control is power," it reminded her. But true power wasn't about controlling others. It was about refusing to let others control you. As the applause filled the room, Rachel Morrison smiled and thought about MIT, about the future waiting for her beyond Lincoln High's walls, and about the teenage girl who had learned that sometimes the best way to defeat a system wasn't to join it or escape it. Sometimes you just had to break it completely and build something better in its place. The revolution was over. The rebuilding had just begun.